Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to another Nightlight excursion into a fascinating subject. And, for about the last 2 minutes, it has definitely been an excursion. I became aware of Brian J. Jones's biography of Washington Irving a few years ago when I read an exuberant review in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I got him to be the guest for tonight and wanted him to return to be a guest to do his Jim Henson biography. And Barbara said, well, I want to do that one. I said, but I found the guest, and she said, well, it's my network. So Brian is invited to be back, but who knows who the host will be for that one. Anyhow, Brian is a New York Times best-selling biographer of people who made great impacts on pop culture. And tonight is, we'll be covering Washington Irving, but he has biographies of Jim Henson, George Lucas, and Dr. Seuss. And if you want to learn more about our guest, his website is brianjjones.com. And I just want to say welcome, Brian, to Nightlight. How are you doing?
I'm good. Can you hear me? Good evening.
Yeah. I was got a little problem with the mic. Barbara couldn't hear me, but I could hear her. I think we got something, plugged in at the last second. I apologize. We usually don't have that problem. Then Skype changed their screen. So anyhow, I said ugh and a few other things too. But we're underway. I think we have just a fascinating subject tonight. I have about 6 books are here here in front of me. Of course, one of them is your Washington Irving biography, and that's a fantastic book, well done, and I'm really excited to get into such an important American literary figure. And one of the things I really enjoyed about your book is I was already a fan of that 1820s, 30s, and 40s time period, and Poe, Melville, Hawthorne, Squire and Davis writing, that they're Um, the first book published by the Smithsonian about all the mounds in Ohio. It's just really interesting look at the creativity from that time period, and one of the people behind that is Washington Irving. So let's just start off with some of the biographical basics, like the parents and brothers and sisters. When was Washington born? And
Sure.
we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so Irving was born in New York City on April 3rd, 1783, which is actually the week that the American Revolution ended, and died in November of 1859, right before the Civil War began. So Irving sort of bridges that era there in American history. He's the he's the youngest of, I'm going to forget the number now, I think 7 surviving children, ultimately, of a very successful merchant in New York, and he's very devoted to his mother. Clearly thinks his mother is a saint. He, at a very young age, his teachers are frustrated with him, sort of throw up their hands and declare him a dunce, and despair that he will ever do anything with his life. But Irving is one of these guys who, was I compared his literary taste more with, if it was nowadays, he'd be the kind that was sitting reading comics and, Mad Magazine and classics. But he's not really, one of these guys that's, very erudite and was reading, the Roman classics and the things that, presidents were reading at the time. Irving was very well read in the pop culture of his era. And that mentality really sort of informed the way that he wrote. In fact, as he moved forward, he wrote in very, normal American English, which makes him a unique voice in that era. So he's actually named for George Washington because, as I said, he was born the week the American Revolution ended. He was actually, as a child, he was when Washington was parading through New York City to go be sworn in as president there in New York. Irving had this nanny who was something of a Washingtonian groupie who carried him into the city and put him on her shoulders to wave at the president, and then walked him over to Washington at one point and said, here's a boy who was named after you. And Washington, according to Irving at least, placed his hands on Irving's head and blessed him as his namesake. There's actually if you go to Washington Irving's house in Tarrytown, hanging in his bedroom is a little watercolor of that moment. I mean, whether it actually happened or not, it's a fantastic story. And you sort of, again, there's Irving bridging, the American Revolution with the modern era. So, so let me build up to the era you were talking about. So one of the first things Irving does, as a young man, is he ends up in the law offices of a New York attorney named Josiah Ogden Hoffman to study law, because that's what promising young men of that era kind of did, was they studied law. And Irving was much more interested in sort of dabbling with his own writing than studying law. And he visits Canada on extended business trips and starts keeping a journal. He starts submitting letters to the Morning Chronicle in New York City under a pseudonym, under the name of Jonathan Oldstyle, which is a name he'll come back to later on in his life. But Irving's writing letters pretending to be sort of this old, this old gentleman in New York who's talking about the theater district and things like that. They're very, interesting and fun letters. And the public kind of, thinks these are very entertaining and very, they don't know who this is behind it, although Irving is the worst kept secret behind the Jonathan Oldstyle books or the Jonathan Oldstyle letters. So that's sort of Irving's first brush with local fame, and he really kind of likes that and eats that up. Probably the major thing that happens in his life around this time is in 1806 or so. Well, let's start with 1807. He and a bunch of his young friends, Governor Kemble, Henry Brevoort, who's sort of a New York blue blood, James Kirk Paulding, they formed this group of, sort of artistic young men who called themselves the Lads of Kilkenny. And Irving starts putting together this magazine with Paulding and his oldest brother, William, who would eventually become a congressman, that they call Salmagundi. And it's sort of the equivalent of Mad Magazine in 1807. Like I said, Irving was sort of raised on this pop culture, and like he creates something that's almost like The Onion or Mad Magazine, and he's poking fun at New York culture and New York styles and New York personalities. And it actually is successful even sort of beyond New York. It gets a little bit of notoriety. It goes about 20 issues. Irving, they end up canceling it, bickering over money with their publisher, which would be a theme throughout Irving's life as well.
Right. We'll get into that.
And then the next big project he has, and this is one we can talk about a little more in depth because I think this is a hugely important project in his life, is he writes a fictional, what we would call nowadays a mockumentary, a fictional history of New York.
Uh-huh.
And he's writing at the same time he's sort of wooing the daughter of the judge he's working for, a young woman named Matilda Hoffman, who dies of tuberculosis at age 17. And Irving, in his despair, goes whizzing up the Hudson, and finishes the book in Kinderhook. And then he does something really, really brilliant. So in the weeks leading up to the publication of this book, he's going to publish it in December of 1809. He starts putting fake ads in the newspapers in New York City, saying, I'm the proprietor of a hotel here in New York City, and there was a guy in my room. So he looked sort of this, demented old man. He didn't look like he was in his right mind, and he went staggering away from my hotel, and he didn't pay his bill. And so I'm trying to find this guy, so he'll pay his bill. His name is Diedrich Knickerbocker, and he left behind this big book that he was working on. And if he doesn't show up to pay his bill, I'm afraid I'm going to have to, publish this book to get some sort of, money back on this deal here. New York City is on fire with this. Like, everybody's following this story. They're hiring search parties to go find Diedrich Knickerbocker. Another letter Irving places about a week later says, I was on the stagecoach heading north, and I saw him wandering by the side of the road. And Irving's really got the public right where he wants them. And then finally, on publication date, he says, all right, well, we're gonna have to publish this book. Diedrich Knickerbocker did not show up to claim his book, so we are going to publish his book. And to huge interest, Irving publishes A History of New York by Diedrich Knickerbocker. Again, a fake history of New York, but it really rockets Irving to fame. I still think to this day it's one of his finest moments. It's one of his funniest books. He writes it as a young man. He went back many years later when he was the most famous man in the world and sort of touched the book back up and took out a lot of the dirty jokes and some of the takedowns of President Jefferson at that time. But that to me is like when Irving really starts to find his voice. And Diedrich Knickerbocker, in fact, this is where the New York Knicks get their name from. Diedrich Knickerbocker is the Knick in New York Knicks. To be a Knickerbocker became meant to be all things New York. So if you're a Knicks fan, you can thank Irving for helping give them their name.
Yeah, that story about the putting the ads in the paper, that's some great pre-publicity. Just really ingenious.
Yeah, I mean that's 1809. That's viral marketing in 1809. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and okay, so in the history of New York, that's where we first encounter Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow.
No, that comes along much later. That
that's later. Okay.
That comes along 18, 19, and 20.
But it's just more of a continuation of the Salmagundi comedy. He's just doing it on his own.
Yeah, so Irving's writing History of New York all on his own, and it's it's filled with slapstick. He's making fun of these these Dutch governors that are their pants are ripping, and they fall off their horses, they're throwing onions at each other, and they land in cow manure on the ground. I mean, it's the Marx Brothers that he's got going on in the book. I mean, it's entertaining one moment after another. This is what makes Irving sort of, again, famous all up and down sort of at this point, the original 13 colonies, all up and down the American seaboard. And Irving, has got some modicum of fame now at this point. He becomes a magazine editor. He's editing a magazine called The Analectic during the War of 1812. He actually is one of the first American publishers to publish a poem by Francis Scott Key, and he says, this poem by Key, I think, could really go places. and sort of is really one of the first publishers to fall in love with what would become our national anthem, publishes it in the pages of the Analectic.
Wow.
And he ends up, and even then he goes back and he's still messing. He's like George Lucas with Star Wars in a way. He's never content with the history of New York, and he has to keep going back and adding to it and polishing it and editing it. But there is one moment in about 1812 when in one of his revisions, he gives us sort of the first version of Santa Claus. He talks about somebody having a dream of St. Nicholas and flying over the treetops in his wagon and, and laying his finger aside of his nose. So, I mean, Irving is creating Santa Claus there in 1812, well before, Clement Moore did. So if you're a fan of Christmas, Irving is already laying the ground for Christmas there in 1812.
Okay, and as we get further into the show, we'll talk about his friendship with another Christmas author, Dickens. But we'll get to that. It's really interesting how there, even though the Atlantic separated, the colonies or early states, from England, there was really a lot of communication still going on, and it seemed like there was some exchanges of ideas. There's, I think that's what I find to be so interesting in that time period is the writing was just so creative. It just left a wonderful legacy. And
yeah, I mean, so Irving's, the lightning in a bottle that Irving gets comes along with the sketchbook, and that takes us to about 1819. So, Irving hasn't written anything in about 10 years when he starts taking on the sketchbook. He's written that History of New York, and he's sort of dabbled in magazine editing, and Irving is always looking, he's always looking for a full-time job that he can be appointed to by somebody else, and he's constantly sort of going hand in hand and trying to get positions. And his brother is a congressman, and at one point, Irving goes to Liverpool to take over the family business, which is failing. And for Washington Irving, that is the worst punishment he could possibly have had. Going through family bankruptcy to Irving was humiliating. You had to appear in court and, stand there while everybody took pot shots at you for your debtors, and it was just awful, and it was a terrible experience for Irving. And, really took up his life for about 2 years, doing nothing but trying to bail out the family business and save the family. Irving was a very devoted member of his own family. He and his brothers were very close, and Irving saw it as his obligation to do this, but was absolutely miserable doing it. And finally decides to start dabbling in some short stories. And there's sort of a really key moment in American literature, actually, when his brother William, the congressman, writes to him from the United States, where he's, a sitting congressman, and says, I found you a job. You can go be the executive assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. I've already talked with the president about it. I talked with the Secretary of Defense about it. Or Secretary of War, I guess at that time. Come home, and we have a job for you. And then you could write on the side if you want, because this pays pretty well. And Irving writes back to his brother and says, I'm going to stay here in London, and I'm gonna work on the stuff that I've already started dabbling with. It's sort of this all or nothing moment for him. It's a pivotal moment in American history. Had Irving gone home, we may not have ever had the sketchbook, and we may not have had this career out of Irving. Irving is the first American to sort of make his living writing full time, and that's a moment in history when it almost didn't happen. But what Irving finally does is he starts writing short stories that he eventually wants to publish in something he calls the sketchbook. He has a heck of a time finding a publisher for this. It ends up being about 31 short stories, but he's writing them constantly throughout 1819 and 1820. And Irving is actually self-publishing, because this is what you do at the time, and is having a heck of a time finding a publisher. And he strikes up a friendship, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. He strikes up a friendship with Walter Scott, who was at that time probably the most famous, one of the most famous novelists in the world. And Walter Scott says Irving actually goes to Scotland to visit him and stays with him for quite a bit, and it's a really formative relationship, a genuinely warm friendship between these guys. And Scott sets him up with his publisher, John Murray. And Murray publishes the sketchbook and sort of blasts Irving out into the world. It's like the story about Byron, who said he woke up in the morning famous. Irving kind of has this happen with the sketchbook. And he does something else really important with this, and I know we'll also talk about this as well. Irving understood copyright law, which in the sense that there was no copyright law at this time. And Irving does something really smart. It used to be that if you published a book in the United States, somebody could take that book across the ocean on a boat, bring it to London, and publish it. And as the author, you had no rights to it. They could publish it and make all the money off of it, and the author was screwed in the United States. You could also go the other way and take the book from London to the United States and publish it over there, and the author in the UK was also in trouble. And Irving at one point was sort of trying to set himself up in business as a middleman who would bring books from the United States to publish them in the UK, sort of stealing from authors. But Irving understands sort of the trappings of copyright law and does something very smart. He publishes his short stories. He publishes the sketchbook, which ends up being published, I think, in 7 parts, simultaneously on both sides of the ocean. So he's protecting his own copyright that way by making sure he's controlling the printing of it. He prints it in Philadelphia at the same time he's publishing it in London. So it protects his copyright. And I think that's one of the moments right there that Irving becomes a really strong advocate for making sure that American writers have copyright protection, which is guaranteed in the Constitution, by the way. But Irving really starts to go to bat for American writers, saying Americans deserve their own literature. And if Americans deserve their own literature, they need to be protected and compensated for it.
That's, the little bit of, the legal angle that Washington is taking at that time, even though he's kind of like been called to the bar, he's really going to demonstrate that later on as a public official working on behalf of the United States in. He's doing work in Spain
multiple capacities, right? Yeah, and the embassy in London. Yeah, teachers
thought that, like you said, he was a dunce. He was. It just seemed like it really took him a long time to blossom, but once he did, he really made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to call him a late bloomer, kind of. I mean, he does write History of New York when he's still relatively young. Irving's superpower, he was, like I said, he was well-read in sort of contemporary pop literature, not necessarily what we consider classics, but Irving's superpower is the power of his personality. He had this ability to ingratiate himself to anybody. He was in the Capitol when Madison was president, when his brother was a congressman, and was visiting D.C. and ends up finagling an invitation to the White House from Dolly Madison. He's one of these guys that people just wanted him at their parties. He was great company. He loved talking with the ladies. He was a good conversationalist. He had a knack for showing up as dinner was being put down on the table a lot of times. But he definitely earned his dinner. He was a great conversationalist, a great listener. That was one of his great powers. It was one of his great charms. And I think that's one of the reasons that we did see him being later in life being such a successful diplomat. He actually at one point is sort of the assistant to Martin Van Buren when Van Buren is our diplomat in London, and Irving's sort of his right-hand man. And then Irving is later appointed to be the ambassador to Spain. And part of it is on the strength of books he's written about Spain, and he spoke fluent Spanish, but he was a smart diplomat. He had a diplomatic personality, in a matter of speaking. So that was really one of his powers too. He was really personable, and I think that's what makes Irving's writing exceptional. And that was actually one of the things that I really fell in love with when I first got interested in writing about him. It's a long story. I'll go into a little bit. I got interested in Irving because I'm a huge fan of Christmas. And I had read a book all about the history of Christmas, particularly in the United States, where we have this very dewy-eyed vision of Christmas, all about the children and the Christmas carols and presents and snow and, the fireplace and food. And in this book, it's called The Battle for Christmas. The historian points out, he goes, that never really existed because in the American colonies for a long time, Christmas was actually outlawed because people used it as an excuse to overeat and get drunk. And there were fights going on all the time, and there's still remnants of it that show up in A Christmas Carol, like We Wish You a Merry Christmas, where people are like singing at somebody's door and they're saying, now bring us some figgy pudding, and we won't go until we get some, and then they would drag you out of your house and beat you up if you didn't bring them their figgy pudding. So the governors were like, the governor said, we've had it. That's Christmas is outlawed. It's like Alan Rickman and Robin Hood. Cancel Christmas. So Christmas is sort of like it's not the glamorous ritzy holiday it is today. Irving is the one who in his sketchbook writes 5 short stories. They're hidden in plain sight. It's 5 short stories right in the middle of the sketchbook. Remember, the sketchbook is about 30 short stories. Irving's got 5 of them in there called Old Christmas, and in those stories, his narrator, Jeffrey Crayon, that's Irving's sort of persona. That's also his pen name, but. Is going back to is visiting Squire Bracebridge for Christmas, and they pull up in the sleigh in front of Bracebridge Hall, and they proceed to go to the dinner table, and everyone's having a great time, and there's a lot of food. And Irving writes about food like nobody else, and there's a lot of there's children singing, and there's presents, and everyone's saying, oh boy, Squire Bracebridge, I mean, he is kicking it old school. This is the way Christmas has always been celebrated. Even as Irving kind of turns to the reader and says, we know this is all baloney, right? Like Squire Bracebridge is out of his mind. But, and that's part of Irving's joke. It was so beautifully explained. It was one of those, Irving was like, this is a holiday tradition, that enough people picked up on that and said, that should be a holiday tradition. One of those readers who fell in love with that portrayal of holidays was Charles Dickens, and carries that forward a little bit. So Irving is sort of, again, I already talked about him with St. Nicholas and Santa Claus, is sort of inventing the traditional Christmas by making it up and just telling us, no, this is the way Christmas is always sort of celebrated. He's making it all up, which is really brilliant. So those were the stories that I sort of rediscovered Irving by reading those short stories. And the other thing I really love about him, and this is when I talk about him being a great conversationalist, is I picked him up ready for this to be like Nathaniel Hawthorne Puritan prose. And Irving is not like that at all. Irving writes in this very conversational tone. There's not a lot of sort of obscure words in it or anything like that. And every once in a while it sort of breaks the fourth wall. Like I said, with Squire Bracebridge, he turns to the reader and he's like, Squire Bracebridge is kind of nuts. Irving's always letting the reader in on it. It's a voice that's really, really surprising, especially when you compare it to other books at the time. So that was where I really fell in love with him, and his style was just that voice is so strong and so distinct, especially in the 19th century.
Yeah, and I just wanted to read something, what you were saying about the fans he had and how much Dolly Madison found him to be a delight. You're right. To his surprise and delight, Irving and the First Lady had become friends. Mrs. Madison admired the young man more for his social and dancing prowess than his writing, and Irving spoke of her fondly for the rest of his life. As for the president, while Mrs. Madison herself once noted that her husband would stand in the middle of the room with no one to talk to, Irving was impressed by the president's skills as an active listener, a most agreeable man in conversation, yet looking back, Irving wondered, what did he say? I had talked entirely myself. The president, in fact, was also a fan. The president pronounced me a promising young man, Irving reported, but that I talked too much. But just quotes like that from some of your major American figures it just really gives you an insight into. It seemed like a really nice guy to be around, and he just gabs too much.
Yeah, I mean,
That's not too bad.
He does talk too much, and he talked too much probably his entire life. And I think at one point he sort of shakes his head sadly, and I think he refers to medicine as a withered apple John. I think he was at one point. So a sharp observer of people. In fact, he actually attends Aaron Burr's trial almost daily when Burr's on trial. And feel sorry for Burr. I mean, Irving's family were Burrites, but Irving really feels sorry for Burr and goes to visit him, after he's, a beaten man, and his heart just goes out to the poor guy the entire time. And Irving's one of the eyewitness accounts to history. I have a colleague who wrote a book about Burr called American Emperor. It's by David Stewart, a really brilliant writer and a great guy.
He's a nice guy. I've met him.
And I gave him Irving's letters home to his family all about the Burr trial, because again, it's a firsthand commentary on what was going on. You don't get that often in American history, especially from somebody who's being hugely famous. And that's what I thought was so fun about Irving as well. He's like Forrest Gump. In the 19th century, we're not even that far into this conversation. We've already talked about, James Madison and Dolly Madison and Aaron Burr and, and Sir Walter Scott. Irving tended to know, everybody who was anybody. And especially as Irving himself gets more and more famous, he really is sort of our most famous man in that era. The famous start flocking to him. So as a biographer and a writer, he's a really fun character to write, but he really is like moving through, the famous busts on the mantelpiece of history.
Yeah, and you're right. Burr also requested the assistance of a rookie lawyer from New York named Washington Irving.
Yeah.
He really isn't. Doesn't have anything under his belt other than
family connections.
Yeah, and why is the former vice president contacting him? And right. Even years later, Irving still had no idea why he had been sent for.
I think Burr maybe was hoping for kind of what happened, though Irving never did it publicly. Like Irving, really felt sorry for Burr. And I think maybe part of Burr was like, I don't really care about his legal skills, but I want him to write something very sympathetic about me in the newspaper, which Irving never did. Because Irving had been, writing when he wrote those letters with Jonathan Oldstyle in the Morning Chronicle. That was considered a Burr newspaper. So, I mean, Irving was writing in newspapers that were favorable to Burr. I think Burr was partly hoping that Irving might write something favorable about him in one of the newspapers, but Irving never did.
Yeah, it's there's so much to write about, and David's book, American Emperor, really he does just a masterful job of laying out everything that was going on with the trial and some of these shady dealings with the Blennerhassetts and going down the river and kind of recruiting some people. What were they really planning? Where were they thinking about maybe setting up this empire within America?
With Burr as the American Emperor,
and that whole thing seems like so many aspects of it were not even close to being constitutional, and there's Washington didn't write anything about it, but he's sitting there observing the trial with all these, like that Wilkerson guy eventually showing up to give his testimony. There's some really, the whole thing was just really shady, and there's some.
It's great theater, and Irving loved writing, and Irving loved writing about the theater. Again, I think Burr was smart. in that regard to like put Irving there, because Irving again had made his name in a Burr newspaper writing about the theater. And Burr's trial was great theater, including Wilkerson, who Irving just hated with every fiber of his being, watching him, prance around up there. And Irving made fun of the way he dressed, and just Irving couldn't stand the guy. It was good theater, good drama. I mean, and in his correspondence, I mean, it really comes through. It is too bad that Irving never wrote an article or anything about it. I think it would have been dynamite, and I think Burr knew that.
Yeah, there's a captivating story there. It's the whole what you wrote, and what we know from David's book. We know some of what was going on, but do we know the whole story with what Burr was planning on doing? And that whole thing is just
that's great. And David does about as good a job as probably anyone's going to do in breaking it all down and and digging it all up. Yeah. I really like that part of the early 19th century time period as well, since it didn't happen all that far from my house, so it's of local interest to me. Right.
But when one, and you just mentioned a few minutes ago about using Jeffrey Crayon, with Salamungi, he was using
Will Wizard, and all sorts of interesting names there. Somebody Lancelot Longstaff, you gotta like that one.
He when he was in Spain writing his biography of Columbus, he wanted to use Fray Antonio Agapita.
I think,
okay. We already covered Diedrich Knickerbocker. What does that say about him using 4 or 5 different pseudonyms?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think part of it is that I think partly it's just fun. I mean, again, Irving loves the theater. I think this is him playing a role. It lets him be somebody other. And first of all, we should make it clear, Irving always made sure people knew it was him. He wasn't going to let some fictional character get all the credit. Like it was the worst kept secret that he was all these different writers. But I mean, I think it let him experiment with voice a little bit. I think he enjoyed pretending to be different personas. What's interesting to me is so that history of New York that's written under the pseudonym of Diedrich Knickerbocker, I think, again, as I said earlier, is Irving's purest. I think that's the voice that's probably closest if you sat in a bar and listened to Irving talk. And when he's writing the sketchbook, for the most of the time, he's writing under the pseudonym of Jeffrey Crayon, which is why it's called The Sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon. But there are moments in the sketchbook when Irving stops and says, hang on a second, we found this story among the papers of Diedrich Knickerbocker, who we've established is leaving papers around all the time with stories in them, including A History of New York. But he says, we found this story among the papers of Diedrich Knickerbocker. And that's one of those stories is Rip Van Winkle. And all of a sudden, like, this is the story that just rockets Irving to fame. And when Irving slips into that Knickerbocker persona, I think that's when he's really at his best, and he's doing it with Rip Van Winkle, and he does it again for the short story. That it wasn't the last one back then, but it is now. The story that when they publish the sketchbook nowadays, usually the first of the 30 some odd stories is Rip Van Winkle, and the exclamation point on the last of them is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. That's another one that is Diedrich Knickerbocker. So it's so interesting to me that like the two really memorable stories in there were the ones that were found among the papers of Diedrich Knickerbocker. When Irving's got that cloak on, like all the pistons are really firing as a storyteller and as a writer, I think.
Since we have touched on being his involvement in writing on both sides of the Atlantic, and he was good friends with Sir Walter Scott. You bring up that he was in, kind of sounds like regular contact with Mary Shelley. This is what, kind of like right around the time that she would be publishing Frankenstein.
I can't remember the time period. She had only just recently become a widow. This is around 1825 or so.
Yeah, okay,
it's 1825 or so. So because this is when he's in France, and somebody smarter than I am will know when Frankenstein was published. I don't know, but she so she's the widow at that point, and she's very interested in Washington Irving. She almost has like this schoolgirl crush on him. And she's asking one of his friends, John Howard Payne, who's sort of this rounder, to bring her copies of Irving's letters so she can read his letters and look at his handwriting. Like, this is the closest she can get to him right now. There's no there's no Instagram or anything. She can't see pictures of him, so she wants to at least see his handwriting, like pieces of paper he's touched and his handwriting, his signature. And she looks at all these letters of Irving's, and she's really, like I said, got this little crush on him, and she's making jokes to her friends about, maybe them getting married someday, but their courtship is going so slowly that, they'll be as old as the dinosaurs by the time it actually happens. And it's very cute. And Irving's in Paris at the time, and she's trying to correspond with him, and she gives a bunch of correspondence to Payne to then bring to Irving. And Irving reads through all this correspondence, never really says what's going on, and in his private letters writes, read Mrs. Shelley's correspondence, went to bed. And that's it. That's all we ever get of that relationship. And it's one of those staggering moments in literature where you're like, this could have been like, Kenneth Branagh and I can think of his wife, like this power couple at the time.
Yeah, right.
Especially it would have been an international power couple, like the American writer and the English writer. I mean, it would have been fantastic, but Irving is just not interested. Irving had up to about 1823, been wooing another young woman. I think he was much more interested in her mother, actually. And that relationship had hit the skids as well. So I'm not sure Irving was in the mood for another relationship anyway. But that one is just tantalizing and annoying in the sense that Irving just completely blows it off and never says another word about it.
Yeah, the same type of friendship with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You would think that their interest in, just say, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner are two really great Gothic literary pieces, and they really they met, but it didn't seem like they were really didn't hit it off. Yeah,
Irving kind of like runs into him at a party, I think, that his publisher Murray is hosting, and is not that impressed with him at all. And we don't know the whole story. Maybe he just wasn't that great of a conversationalist. That would have been enough to turn Irving off, I think. Irving. Irving's fascinating in his taste and in who he warms to. He meets Edgar Allan Poe when Poe's a boy. I mean, Poe's not Edgar Allan Poe at the time, because Irving meets with Poe's father, who's coming to a meeting about business over in London, and brings his son with him, Edgar Poe, with him. And then Irving finally doesn't actually meet him, but Poe writes a letter to Irving later, doing what we as writers do, which is like, please blurb my book, essentially. And Poe sends Irving two short stories. He sends him House of Usher, and I think William Wilson is the other one.
Okay. Yeah.
And Irving is almost baffled by this House of Usher stuff. Like, he says some nice things about William Wilson. I don't think he says anything that much about House of Usher. It's just Poe's already speaking a language that Irving just doesn't. Irving is still sort of connected to that older world, even as he's advancing the ball. If Irving's gothic horror, if you will, Poe is psychological horror already, and Irving can't quite make that leap. But promotes Poe. I mean, Irving is adamant in that Americans need American writers, and Poe, for his part, is grateful. Tells his publisher, he tells his publisher essentially, Irving blurred my book, which is what publishers want to hear. But then he says, gosh, Irving is he's so overrated. I don't understand. Yeah, he went first. What good is that? I mean, that doesn't make him great. I don't think Poe really understood or appreciated that going first meant going it alone. Irving didn't, Irving had a Walter Scott, of course, to help him along, but there were no American role models. Irving's the first American to kind of start doing this and becoming a writer and figuring out, copyright. How do you keep from getting screwed on copyright? And how do you make sure your work is edited the way you want to? Irving's doing that himself, and he's actually planting book reviews at one point, having his friends write book reviews for him back in the United States. Irving's figuring a lot of this out. He's creating the American, author, the American artistic personality for an author. And I don't think Poe really appreciated that. I mean, Poe was very interested in the work, of course, but I don't think really appreciated, the fact that Irving went first meant Poe had an Irving to suck up to. Irving did not have that. I don't think Poe ever really appreciated that.
Yeah, and, Washington was maybe about 20 years older than Poe.
Poe, I think, was born in 1800 or 1809. 1809. Yeah, because he died at 40 in 1849. So yeah, so Irving was about 26. I think that 26 years on him. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We try not to do math on this show, so it's just
somebody fact check that. Yeah.
I was doing some other research for tonight's show. I read some from Beneath the American Renaissance, The Subversive Imagination in the Age of Emerson and Melville by David Reynolds. And just to show another aspect of the difference between like Washington's diverse writing, and he was maybe a little bit just more gothic, and Poe was more psychological horror type writer. David Reynolds writes, if Irving had created humor from the collision of the quiet with the irrational, the frontier humorist created it by forgetting the quiet altogether and taking the irrational to a perverse and therefore funny extreme, and eventually leads to the tall tale and Mark Twain.
The Twain.
But there is the sense of humor that Washington brought to his short stories, like the petticoat government that are mentioned in Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah, but the tongue is the only tool that grows sharper by use. Another great phrase. I think you're right. I mean, I think partly, again, Irving has that, has one foot planted in sort of that old world. Mm-hmm. But, so he's not cutting loose the way sort of the next generation did, because I think he's still adhering to some of those norms, that sort of erudite voice in a way. Even as he's advancing the ball, because again, Irving can't really help but be funny, because I think from being a great conversationalist and sitting in drawing rooms and having conversation and entertaining the ladies, and then going with his male friends and getting drunk out by the river, and I think Irving can't really help but be funny. There's no way it's not going to come through. So Irving is still balancing, that sort of slapstick sensibility, if you will, that he can sometimes have, with sort of the old formal ways. And you do see the evolution as the next generation comes along. And as you said, they sort of throw out, out the formality at that point and are just running their mouths at that point. Irving didn't quite get there, because again, he's sort of the bridge between the two of those. But I think part of it is Irving is funny. And I think that voice, more than anything, as I mentioned, like just hearing him talking to you in his stories. I mean, I think that's really the strength of his stories. It is like sitting with somebody in a bar or in your living room or in a drawing room at that time, telling you a story. It's this very relaxed tone. And it makes everything much more personable. And I think that's one of the reasons people loved his work. I mean, Irving got to the point where if he, when he was renovating his house, if he needed money to renovate his house, he would write a book because he knew it would sell like gangbusters. And so at one point, he eventually gets accused of bookmaking, which was, I guess, certainly fair. But I mean, he was the voice readers really wanted to hear. There's just something inherently entertaining about that sort of casual tone that we get out of Irving.
One of the questions, or parts of your book that I really want to get into, since I just happened to mention later in that 19th century, Twain leaves his imprint on humor, but when Washington was, high school age, he's making some trips to the Hudson Valley, and you mentioned, I'm trying to find it real fast. And there were those old Dutch legends and local ghost stories. Villagers spoke of these strange cries heard in the woods where the captured British spy John Andre had been hanged. And
right.
Go over page 15, and there's some references about pirates, pirate stories, and more goblins and stuff like that. But
right.
It really seems like you get Washington Irving is related to the Hudson River and his retirement home. Would be along it. Tarrytown, or Sunnyside would be right along the river, where had lots of childhood memories, and Mark Twain in the Mississippi, and Dickens in the Thames. What is it about these like rivers that appeal to some of these authors? If you think of the Mississippi, Huck Finn or Mark Twain, something it really on American and British literature. Scott wrote about the Tweed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really interesting.
It's a great point. I mean, you're right. So Irving got sent up river. That sounds terrible. Got sent up river as a child to escape yellow fever in New York. I think twice, in fact, and stayed with his friend James Kirk Paulding up in that region, and was fascinated by, in sort of that Tarrytown region and the Sleepy Hollow region, was fascinated by the Dutch. and how, how the way they talked, and how they, had these great big gigantic Bibles that you opened with, that you had to unlock and had buckles on them. And, he was so fascinated by Dutch stories and the ghost stories he was hearing along the, I think part of the reason rivers are so significant is because they're carrying people and carrying information and carrying those histories. Irving loved even going all up the Hudson further to the Catskills, and that's where Rip Van Winkle is sort of born. The story of Rip Van Winkle takes place in the Catskills, and he comes down out of the mountains there, up near Kinderhook, I think. So, Irving is hearing a lot of these, as he calls them, like, the tales of the pirates, but the wives' tales, literally, like the stories that the wives are telling each other, and the ghost stories you tell to your kids to make them go, come in at night and not stay out late. And Irving is a great synthesizer of these stories. He's great at like listening to these stories and compressing them and taking the interesting pieces of them and discarding the rest and then turning them into something new. I mean, it really is a salmagundi. A salmagundi is like a chef's salad. It's made up of a lot of different things. And Irving is really good at doing this with a lot of the stories you heard. I mean, a story like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I mean, there's stories of headless horsemen that show up in other stories, and German stories. And Irving talked about when he was traveling at one point through Europe, they went into a cave to get out of a rainstorm, and somebody told a story about a headless horseman even in there. So Irving was constantly hearing these ghost stories, but he was, he was synthesizing them into something brand new. And so the stories feel familiar, even as they're entirely new, because they are, again, they're based in all these stories Irving has heard. But one of the things that makes a story like Rip Van Winkle or Legend of Sleepy Hollow really important is they are distinctly and intentionally taking place in the United States. You didn't get that in 1819. This is the time period when Jefferson is bickering with people in France about whether our animals are smaller than theirs. And it's like we're always trying to elbow aside the British, make sure they understand that we really can write. And Irving is the first American who proves that Americans can write. While people in London were actually thought he had to be English. They're like, this is an Englishman because no American could write this well. But Irving's stories, Legend of Sleepy Hollow talked about the tree where they hanged Major Andre. I mean, that is in the story. It is most definitely taking place in Sleepy Hollow, New York, or in a idealized version of Sleepy Hollow, New York, at least. I've been to several small towns along the Hudson up in there, and they all claim that they're originally Sleepy Hollow, even though there is a Sleepy Hollow, New York. There are other small towns that like to say they're the inspiration for Sleepy Hollow. But those stories take place in the United States. The Rip Van Winkle takes place in the Catskills, and they're talking about the British losing the war, for crying out loud, in there. So, that's one of the really important things Irving does. He's the first one to say, hey, we're Americans. We have an American literature. That didn't happen in 1819.
With these settings like the river, and we can get into the Spanish settings. What was Washington's creative process? I just have an interest in that. It seems like early in tonight's discussion, you said that it is history of New York, and then there's a gap of 9 years or so before he published the sketchbook, and there were other times when he really wasn't writing, and he started picked up the pen once he needed money. It was kind of like just getting started on writing when
he has that
he
period.
to.
He has that period in his career that I call his professional period, in that he's released the sketchbook and he wants to show he's not a one-trick pony, so he comes back with Bracebridge Hall, which is essentially sketchbook 2. It's still another big collection of short stories, and then by 1825, now he's got essentially sketchbook 3 with Tales of a Traveler. And even at that point, the critics are kind of like, dude, you're going to the well one time too many on this. And he just gets the worst reviews of his career. And Irving always claimed that he never read his reviews, even as he read every word of them. But that sort of like sends him spiraling a little bit. So that's when he heads to Spain. And that's where we start to get a little bit of a gap, because what he starts to do in Spain is he starts to write nonfiction. He wants to write a biography of Christopher Columbus. He wants to write stories of Spanish history. And because he's the most famous man in the world, he sort of, he gets an invitation from the minister to Spain, Alexander Hill Everett, who says, why don't you just be an attaché to the American Legion here in Madrid, and you can get into the archives here in Spain. There's no Americans coming, but you can read Spanish, and so you've got access to these archives. So that's sort of the period he starts hunkering down. We got a little bit of a gap in his work at that point, because he's determined to write nonfiction at that point.
Yeah, and since we're talking about Spain now, he was given a big honor by the mayor, where he could, I was trying to look for the page, to actually go into Alhambra. Governor Don Francisco de la Serna offered Irving his own apartments in the Alhambra during his stay in the city.
Yeah.
He was granted access to a
it's almost
castle.
It's almost like if you gave somebody nowadays like permission to live in the U.S. Capitol for like 2 months or something.
Yeah, and they aren't even Spanish citizen, and
right.
and the mayor let him in there to do his studying for the Columbus and Grenada book.
Right.
And, that really says something about what people in high places thought of Washington.
Yeah, I mean, there's that power of his personality again. And again, membership has its privileges when you're hugely famous like he is at this point now. He's arguably one of the most famous men in the world. He's published internationally, and again, as Americans, we didn't have that. Irving's published in the United States. He's published in England. He's published in France. I mean, he's there's translations of his work, which again doesn't really happen that much. So he's very famous, but he's also very personable. Just a really nice guy. And so it's not really a problem for them to give Irving free rein. Again, he gets access to the Spanish archives. That it's hard enough when you're Spanish to get into those archives, much less American. And they give him sort of free entry there to take his notes on Columbus. And Irving is reading those documents in their original Spanish. He's not doing like a lot of us do, where we go find the books that have the translations in it. Irving's reading it in its original Spanish, but has free and open access to the Alhambra, sleeping in the building. He's bathing in the fountains in there. He's strolling the halls, just having a great time. At that time, now it's a tourist destination. Back then, it wasn't. It was just, it was the fortress on the edge of town, and Irving lived up there and loved it. It was, had a ball. Was very sad when he finally had to leave it.
Yeah, you're right. Sitting on a hill above the city was its famous Alhambra, an ornate complex of Moorish buildings that included a citadel, palace, administrative quarters, and residences. Irving immediately approached Don Francisco de la Serna, the governor of Alhambra, as well as the Archbishop of Granada, to request complete access. Celebrity has its advantages. Open access was granted willingly. So there, and that must have, you can read some of his short stories that are set in Spain or somehow connected with his residence there. But yeah, that must have been just something that would really jumpstart anyone with, with wanting to write poetry or short story or something. Just really the layers of history there.
Yeah, and it really inspires Irving to write what he would later sort of refer to as his Spanish sketchbook. A number of years later, he would write a book called Tales of the Alhambra. And it was a lot of the the Spanish history and the ghost stories and tales he had heard while living and working in Spain. So yeah, so the Alhambra really inspired him, even as it didn't really show up in his work for a bit. But again, at this point, this is when he's writing his Columbus book and his History of Grenada, and so he's doing a lot of the nonfiction work. He probably would have he was there, I think, almost 2 years, and would have stayed a lot longer. But he gets a letter from the United States saying that you're now the secretary to the American legation in London, and he has to go running off to London to go work for the ambassador in London, who's Martin Van Buren, a New Yorker and a family friend. But that's the only thing I think that could have ever pulled him away from there, was sort of this obligation to his family again, who had secured him that position.
Well, and he was friends with Martin Van Buren, who'd become president in a few years, and also was James Buchanan also in Europe at the same time?
I can't remember. Actually, when Irving first gets called to London, Lewis McLean is the ambassador at that time. But that it's shortly thereafter that Van Buren gets hustled off to London as the cabinet is collapsing, and he ends up picking up. But he's with Lewis McLean, and he actually, he's a really good secretary. He's really good at his job over there. First of all, he's got a reputation, which sort of opens doors for him anyway. But he's also, again, he's got great social skills, probably even better than McLean does. And McLean really appreciated what he did. It was easy to go visit anybody you need. You could just say, yeah, the American minister's here, and he's brought Washington Irving with him. Who's not going to open their door to that?
Yeah, and was it one of those deals? Was with the settling of Oregon?
That came a little bit later. That came when Irving was ambassador to Spain, but he stopped off in London on his way back home, and I think that's where they sealed the deal on that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he part this state of the American minister to the Court of St. James had specifically requested Irving's presence in London to help negotiate the so-called Oregon question. So, and
I think that's it. That's in the 1840s, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Now, one of my favorite moments from Irving's time with Van Buren is, Van Buren doesn't get confirmed to be the minister in England. It's like a big, it's all politics. The U.S. Senate's mad at Jackson, and so they don't confirm Van Buren. And so, Van Buren's kind of sulking around, and Irving, Irving's staying up all night with Van Buren and sort of consoling him. And Irving is astute enough to recognize that that's a martyrdom that will take him far. And Irving actually writes in his journals, "I should not be surprised if this vote of the Senate goes far toward elevating him to the presidential chair." Irving's as astute a politician as any politician of the era, I think.
Okay, and I just note on the page prior to the Oregon question, what Irving's recall was imminent. He had sent several dispatches to the new Secretary of State, James Buchanan, the fifth secretary. Irving served on. Okay, so Buchanan wasn't in London or Europe at the time, but he would go on to Irving was, kind of working with him there towards the end of Washington's career as an American ambassador. But
and probably could have had that post for as long as he wanted. Irving thought his recall was imminent. It was not. That's a job Irving could have had as long as he wanted. Because again, first of all, it's sort of like you see, sort of like nowadays, everybody loves to appoint famous people to ambassadorships.
Yeah.
But Irving was really good at that job, and I think and actually lasted through multiple presidents while he was there.
Yep.
I think he started off with Tyler, and I think Polk kept him there. I think that job was his for as long as he wanted it, actually.
Yeah, and it's really amazing where he was family friends and working side by side with Martin Van Buren. Obviously, there's a short stint with James Buchanan, who would become president. Like you said, Tyler and Polk. What Jackson originally appointed him as the minister to Spain. So he's working with many of the first presidents, fifth or sixth, seventh presidents or something, or future presidents from that 1820s to the about the mid 1840s time period, and those some of those same presidents are going to be featured in a couple weeks when we cover the history of National Road. But I don't think there was any direct connection between doing this show and having Roger as a guest in a couple weeks. But if people want to give me credit for it, that's fine for the action-packed programming. But I think after the show in a couple weeks, people will see how America was really developing in that time period. And Washington's working with all those future presidents and Secretary of State and
the Secretary of State who's receiving most of Irving's dispatches at that time is Daniel Webster. Who's getting dispatches from Spain that probably don't read like any other dispatches he's getting from his official ambassadors at the time. This is an ambassador with a bestseller, and so I'm sure Webster couldn't wait to open the latest dispatch from Spain, coming in from Irving. But but to your point, I mean, Irving is there at a formative time. Like he's keeping tabs on Spain. He's watching, trade interests in Cuba. He's watching, the Spanish debate the slave trade at a time when, we were still enmeshed in the slavery issue. So, so Irving's there at an important time in our relationships in Europe, and he's kind of the right guy for the job. Again, he's typical of Irving, and this must have been great for Webster. Like Irving's sending these almost like gossipy kind of dispatches back, talking about Isabella, Queen Isabella. He was fascinated with her, like watching all the people swirling around her, trying to ingratiate themselves to her. And at one point, there's sort of this skirmish that breaks out again among warring factions there in Spain, and Irving suggests that all the diplomatic corps, every ambassador, get in their coaches and form a human shield around the Queen, which is an insane idea, but like that's how devoted to the cause Irving could be. But Irving's got the house in Spain that everybody wants to go to. He's got the best parties. He's got the best conversation. He's the one that he's doing the job you want your minister to Spain to be doing. He's got his ear to the ground. Everybody's coming to him with information and gossip and things, whether they mean to or not, because his is the place to be. People want to hang out with Washington Irving.
Okay, and while we're still talking about his 17-year residence in Europe. He wasn't that the time when he was in London and he helped to get Melville his first publishing? Type he published in Europe, or had his first publisher read it, the manuscript.
Yeah, they didn't meet. He didn't meet Herman Melville. He met Gansevoort,
his brother,
his brother, who was sort of acting as his agent, and Irving introduced him to his own publisher, to John Murray. And I think, I think the rest is history on that part. So it was something similar to what happened with him with Walter Scott. Walter Scott said, "Let me introduce you to my publisher, John Murray. The guy has good taste." Irving and Murray went round and round and round, and they were usually bickering over money. And at one point, Murray, Irving thought that Murray had promised him he was going to buy his next book, and when it showed up, Murray was like, "This doesn't look anything like a book. This isn't ready. I'm not buying this." And Irving was just apoplectic over it. So, but he and Murray would always come back together again. Murray's very important in his story. Irving made poor John Murray insane. And even as Murray very patiently and very loyally continued to publish Irving his entire life.
Yeah, Murray had a very prestigious lineup of authors that he was publishing.
He was the House of Murray, they called him. Yeah, I think he published Byron in addition to Walter Scott. I think he published. I'll get it wrong. It's one of the Brontes. I can't remember now, but he published everybody who was anybody. He was publishing at that time.
Yeah, and it sounded like it started off as a good relationship, and he's introducing Irving to Coleridge and all these other people, the big names in London in the 1820s and 30s. It eventually became. It had its high points, and it was a rocky relationship at times.
For sure.
It's just how Murray sent an old letter back to Irving and said, "Well, you remember you said this."
Called him out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really what it was like. Washington still got paid. The Columbus book was a huge success, even though Murray was like, get rid of this pseudonym thing. There's just they were always battling, but that's how some things got done at that time.
Yeah,
it still goes on.
I just pulled up one of their letters, which just he and Irving went round and round over Murray's use of the phrase "yes, I'll write to you" at one point. Irving thought that meant yes, not "yes, I'll write to you." And but that was the moment when, as you mentioned, Murray sends Irving back all his correspondence along with a bunch of receipts, and basically says that the publication of Christopher Columbus cost me £5,700. It's only produced £4,700. Like, sends him all the receipts for that. Grenada cost me £3,000, and its sales only produced £1,800, making my loss £2,200. I have thought it better to communicate with you directly rather than through my agent. Let me have time to read your new manuscripts, and then we shall not differ, I think, about terms. I mean, Murray's just had it with him at that point.
It's just all part of the publishing business. I'm sure there are a few people in the audience who are like, I've been there too.
Yeah, I mean, just sending in the receipts was just like the pettiest thing. Especially for Irving, who's like played the game with, again, bailing his family business out of bankruptcy. I just think Irving's probably not in the mood to play that game either. And he and Murray just went like to absolutely ice cold relations at that point. Again, they would warm up again later, but boy, they were hot cold there for a while. And they, like I said, they were constantly bickering over money and royalties, and was Murray going to buy this manuscript and publish it right away? And even when Irving didn't have a manuscript done, I mean, it's just they were constantly going round and round. And Murray, to his credit, was for the most part incredibly loyal and very patient.
His Washington's residence in Spain, spoke about all the castles. Of course, have stories set in cathedrals. You have convents or church ruins. There's to work into the short stories as well. But I got another one of a collection of Washington's short stories, and we don't have to really analyze them, but there's he has one story about Legend of the Two Discrete Statues, and there's something about you could find the treasure by looking at where the two statues' eyes were looking onto the building across the street.
Yeah, it's very national treasure.
Yeah. And then you get the other story, Legend of the Arabian Astrologer, and the chess pieces come to life. You can. The book I'm reading is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, and Other Gothic Tales. Mm-hmm. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow would be considered a Gothic story, but these two Spanish stories that I'm bringing up that he wrote in the 1830s, those really seem like fantasy type pieces. If you wanted to work in the national treasure type as a modern example, I think that would probably fit. There's something moving from New York to Spain, and a whole another culture, and the more culture from the medieval times laid on top of the Spanish culture. It just seems like it gave him a lot of directions to take. Paranormal writing. I don't know.
No, you're right. It was more. It was different influences for him to compress and synthesize. Before we'd had sort of the Dutch influence and the Germanic, fairy tale influence. Now we're getting sort of that. We're getting more of the Spanish influence, and I think that is where you start to see it's not necessarily Spanish, but you start to see a little bit more of the mystical creeping into it. Arabian Nights, that sort of an influence creeping in. You and I were. We'll pull back the curtain. You and I were talking offline at one point, and we were comparing Irving kind of to Richard Matheson and the stuff he would write for the Twilight Zone in a way. I mean, it's stuff that's like supernatural, kind of, but it's almost
it has its
Yeah,
own category. Yeah.
yeah. It's like I always talk about Legend of Sleepy Hollow. People say it's gothic, and I'll say, well, it's Scooby Doo. More than anything else, it's like you get to the end of that, and Irving's got like a Scooby Doo ending. It's like you get to choose the ending you want. You can have the gothic horror ending, you can have the silly ending, you can have the Scooby Doo ending. Irving's sort of doing choose your own adventure at the end of that one, but it's more of a Scooby Doo ending with that, where they pull the head off the horseman, and it's Brom Bones, and he would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you kids. So that that it is gothic, but Irving can't resist giving it a punchline. And I think that is part of what makes how we're almost struggling to compartmentalize his style in these. I think it is because he's overlaid again that sort of nod and a wink personality that comes into a lot of his work, that turns it into something very unique and interesting.
And I was glad to pick up that book. Like you said, it's mainly gothic stories, but like you said, with the Twilight Zone, it has its own category. It's just so many different cultural influences on Washington that this is what you get. It's not really straight out gothic like his friend Mary Shelley and her Frankenstein. It's the living chess pieces telling you where the invader is coming, from over the mountain or up this one pass.
Yeah, and you can imagine this is the kind of story that would come into your head as you're strolling those halls of the Alhambra. Mm-hmm. This very sort of magical place that you have all to yourself. Why would you come up with wondrous stories like that when you're in a place like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just.
And and Irving's writing in the Alhambra, it's much looser than some of his other work. Some of his other work can get to be claustrophobic, and I think a lot of times it reflects his state of mind. He was writing, the sketchbook at a time of, they were done with the bankruptcy, but he'd just come out of like this, terrifying, horrible experience bailing the family business out of bankruptcy, and was trying to like find his voice and find his way. And I think that affects the feel of some of those stories in there. Whereas the Alhambra is something that he wrote at a very happy time in his life. There's a lot of ghost stories and things too, but it's hard to explain. It's a very open narrative. A lot of the work in this, it's a much looser structure. I think he's in a really good place at the time. He's I don't think it doesn't come out till he's back in the United States. But the inspiration for that, I think he was in a good place at that time.
And if you want more of the traditional Gothic paranormal type literature, you do have the guests from Gibbet Island. That's probably more.
And the Flying Dutchman story is in the Tales of the Traveler, I think. So that's a couple of years before that. But
okay, well, yeah, I was just going to say, that Gibbet Island one. Yeah. I think that's just a really neat ghost story as what. That's your traditional ghost story, but the fantasy ones, I really didn't realize that until I started reading your book, and I was like, I need to read a little bit more of this his residence in Spain and its an influence on him, and I was really impressed with that time in his life and the effects it had on his writing. I think you really developed all those aspects of his life into really fascinating biography.
Well, and then I appreciate that. And then we've got sort of the next pivotal moment comes along right after that, because he's in Spain, and that's when he is called. I'm sorry, it's not in Spain yet. It's 1832 is when he's called to go back home. I mean, he's been working in. Oh my gosh! All of a sudden, I've forgotten it. I've forgotten my timeline. He goes home in 1832 after 17 years abroad, and this is the moment when we bring Charles Dickens into the story, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Or does Dickens come? Does Dickens come later? No, Dickens does come into the story at this point. And this is another one of those moments I love. Go ahead.
Dickens makes his first tour of America in 1842.
Okay, so he's I'm getting my timelines conflated here. So he comes. So Dickens visits the United States.
We don't do math.
After Irving has come home from Spain, not from England, right?
Yeah, and
I've lost my brain's just rotted. I've lost my timeline in my head now at this point.
Okay, well, one of the 6 or 7 books brought out to my desk for this was Dickens's American Notes, and in I think it's towards the end of chapter 8, Dickens does talk about that these visitors to whatever their station were not without some refinement of taste and appreciation of intellectual gifts and gratitude to those men who, by the peaceful exercise of great abilities, shed new charms and associations upon the homes of their countrymen and elevate their character in other lands, was most earnestly testified by their reception of Washington Irving, my dear friend, who had recently been appointed minister at the court of Spain and who was among them that night. And it goes on to talk about the madness of American politics.
So there we have the timeline established by Dickens himself. We now know where we are.
Yeah, and he mentions, my dear friend Washington Irving. So so there we are. You developed a little bit more of some of these receptions and parties.
The relationship between Dickens and Irving is actually really fun because this is where I've conflated my time. So Irving and Dickens strike up a friendship just through correspondence initially. This is when Irving's gone back to the United States in 1832, and he's there until about 1842. I think he's there 10 years, and that's when he's starting to think about constructing his own house and so on. But Irving is constantly reading English newspapers because he'd been in the embassy over there, so he's still reading English newspapers, and he starts reading Dickens' work in the period. I think Old Curiosity Shop is one that he really likes. But he starts writing Dickens fan letters, and the two of them start corresponding and sort of strike up this friendship. And so years later, when Irving has come back to the United States after having served in Spain, and Dickens is on his American tour, Irving hosts a dinner for Dickens in New York City. And this was going to involve Irving making a public speech, which is something Irving absolutely dreaded. This is how highly he thought of Dickens, though, and that he was willing to stand up and make a speech in Dickens' favor because he admired Charles Dickens so much. What happens ultimately is Irving has a speech prepared to read about him and Dickens and what a great writer Dickens is. And when Irving stands up, he leaves his speech folded up under his plate and absolutely chokes and can't deliver the speech and sits down completely heartbroken. And Dickens, the consummate pro, stands up and just bails him out with just this magnanimous, gorgeous speech about, I came over here to see the most famous man in America, and there he sits. He's just constantly all about how great Washington Irving is and what a great friend he is. Just a really wonderful moment between these two. But the other really cool thing that happens when Dickens is visiting is Irving invites him to come stay at his home that he's building in Tarrytown, New York, that Irving has called Sunnyside, constantly under construction. Irving's constantly pulling stuff down and building stuff back up, but has Dickens come out there and stay with him. And Irving is staying at the house at that time with his brother Ebenezer. And this is years before A Christmas Carol is written, and Dickens is a big fan of those Irving Christmas stories we talked about a little earlier. In fact, tells Irving at one point how he carried, the sketchbook around with him, and even carried around the history of New York until the pages fell out of it. So Dickens is a fan from way back and knows those Christmas stories very well. So I think Irving shaped and influenced in some form. I don't think we want to overstate it, but definitely had an influence on Dickens and the writing of A Christmas Carol.
Okay, well, Ebenezer is a giveaway there in the time period too, with 1842, and by the Christmas later that year, The Christmas Carol came out.
I can't remember the year of A Christmas Carol, but yeah, this was pre-Christmas Carol when he was with Irving, with Washington and Ebenezer Irving.
Okay, it's I think it came out in 1842 or 43. Okay. So it'd be close, the Christmas of that year or the following year. But yeah, you can see the influence, and yeah, there's it was also at those let me just so in another book I had, the Raven and the Whale by Perry Miller. Yeah, that talks about the dinner for Dickens at the City Hotel on February 18th, 1842, and I guess one thing that was said in that discussion that Washington didn't bring up, but Perry says, "What, sir?" he cried across the unheating room to Irving in the speaker's chair with Dickens straining to hear. "Is the present condition of the field of letters in America?" Cornelius answered that it is anarchy because America is sown broadcast with foreign publications. He did not expect a copyright law automatically to produce American geniuses, but he protested the fraud practice not so much on pirated and unremunerated Englishmen as upon the native youth who would like to add something to the happiness, something to the renown of their country. So, sounds like you're had gussing the copyright earlier in the day, or that was part of the discussion at the dinner, and the American youth were, it needed to be protected too, and I think you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean,
towards the beginning.
This gets back to Irving's, strong belief in that Americans were entitled to, deserved their own literature. And if you want, but as he constantly reminded people, if you want American writers, you have to pay American writers, and you also have to protect their copyrights. And so Irving was constantly striving to, to protect American copyright, to help figure out legislatively how that could be done. And he was lobbying for most of his life. I don't believe in his lifetime anything significant happened. I think it happened shortly after he died, but it certainly would have been something they would have been discussing even at the Dickens dinner, but didn't get it in his lifetime. But that was one of the, Irving was adamant, American literature for Americans. That was us making our way into the world. And Irving, as I mentioned earlier, had proven that Americans could write. Darn it, they'd arrived on the world stage. We had a culture, and our short stories were going to take place in the United States, and they were going to have a distinctive voice, and they weren't beholden to, to the British, standards of writing, or some self-imposed restrictions on the quality of art and the quality of voice or anything like that. So, I mean, it was an American revolution of letters in a sense. as well, and Irving was sort of leading the way, whether he wanted to or not. But he was, again, he was the one who went first, and the first guy through the door is sometimes the guy that takes the bullets. And I think Irving took the bullets going through the door first on that. Again, you had somebody like Poe, who crapped on him, even as Irving was fighting hard for Poe's right to publish. So Irving was always, I think his heart was always in the right place on it. Didn't achieve the legislative victories on it in his lifetime, but was constantly knocking on the door.
Okay, and James Fenimore Cooper, Bryant, and Irving were the big three leading American authors at the time. Yeah, they're still popular today. Yeah,
and Irving and Cooper. So that's another relationship that I would characterize it, I guess, as they, in the same way Irving and John Murray went round and around, he and Cooper went round and around. Really, it was Cooper who went round and around, Irving not so much. Irving really helped Cooper. That was another American writer that he helped get his first book published with Murray, I believe, again. So Irving had bent over backwards to help Americans and help Americans get published and advance the ball for American writers. Cooper never really, I think, sort of like in the same sense Poe didn't either. I don't think Cooper ever really truly appreciated that. Mostly Cooper got very jealous of Irving's money, or at least how much money he perceived Irving was making. Irving never really made a lot of money, partly because he was bad with investments. Another problem was he had a brother who spent all of his money. Irving did okay. He built a very nice house with it. But Irving was one of the reasons he took the job as ambassador to Spain was because he needed the regular salary. But, Cooper was always counting other people's money. And was constantly counting Irving's money. And, at one point, John Jacob Astor dies, one of the richest men in the world, who's a friend of Irving's, and actually makes Irving the executor of his will. Irving's got just enough law in him, I guess, that Astor was comfortable doing that. And Irving had written about Astor in his book, A Story about Oregon. But anyway, the person who was the most upset about that was was James Fenimore Cooper, who was convinced that Irving had just made a ton of money off of this deal. Again, was constantly counting everybody's money. The irony behind it, I guess, is that Cooper died before Irving did, and Irving presided over Cooper's funeral service. Irving had the last word, I guess. But anyway, it was one of those fights that it was a one-sided fight. Cooper was always really tightly wound on this. I don't think Irving really ever got all that upset about it. But boy, Cooper could really get furious. But counting Irving's money was what really set Cooper off.
Okay, and I had a note to tie in that Irving's law degree did pay off, and it is. You may have seen some of it as being a diplomat. May have learned a few things, but he did become John Jacob Astor's executor. So he did put his legal training to work.
Yeah, and if you visit his home, his Sunnyside home there in Tarrytown, they'll tell you a really funny story about him putting his legal skills to work as well, as he's building his house there on the banks of the Hudson. And it's a beautiful house, and it has this beautiful view of the river. And he had trees planted, and then he was cutting down trees in other places to make sure he had this beautiful, unencumbered view of the river. And then the railroad went right through the middle of it. And that's the point at which Irving apparently kicked into lawyer high gear and went down and started filing all the paperwork to try to bog it down and slow it down and stop it if he could. It didn't end up being successful, but Irving knew the legal traps to run and ran those traps for years trying to stop the railroad. Did not win that one, so maybe his legal skills, didn't pay off in that one, but he knew enough to try to slow the process down. And if you take the train up the Hudson River towards towards Albany. You have to look, or if you blink, you'll miss it. But you can actually still see his house from the train.
Okay, we're gonna have to do a field trip up there, nightlight field trip. But yeah, and hopefully, we have probably about 15 minutes left, and we'll get the archive to you tomorrow, and Barbara will do her thing and get it posted tomorrow afternoon. Hopefully, you'll be able to get this to Booger. Yeah,
I want to give a shout out to Curtis Armstrong, who we all, if you're a Gen Xer like me, you remember him from things like Better Off Dead, Booger and Revenge of the Nerds, probably the thing we know him best for, and Risky Business. He was the one who talked about being chased by Guido the Killer Pimp. Curtis is a devotee of the works of Washington Irving. He's also a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes, for example. Just a really well-read, really interesting guy. Who I think will love to listen to this conversation. So, Curtis, if you're listening, how's it going? We're glad to have you.
Yeah, I was so thrilled that you told me that you get the archive to him, or hopefully he's listening live, and that he was such a big part of my youth, growing up with Airplane and Caddyshack, Vacation, 16 Candles, and I Want My $2 from Better Off Dead, and the Curtis's immortal line, Master. Yeah, that's about my life. Looking for someone to teach you how to burp really loudly.
And I can highly recommend his memoir to everybody too. And if you get the audiobook, he reads it. So there's a free plug for you.
Watching some of his videos prior to the show, and the Tri Lambda fraternity, and all the stories the panel had from those couple movies. It's just hilarious to listen to him talk. So
he just responded to me on Twitter, said send me the link when it's available. So he's not listening live, but he'll take the link as soon as it's up. Hi, Curtis.
That's great. That makes my night. So, and hopefully this, even with the little tech thing at the beginning, hopefully, still want to come back. I think it may have to turn that, your Jim Henson biography over to Barbara, since it's her network. But let's do a little preview of what people could expect, with your Jim Henson biography, and what got you interested in writing about Jim Henson?
Well, again, if you're a Gen Xer, like both you and I are, I mean, why wouldn't you want to write about Jim Henson? I guess first of all, we were sort of the first generation. I always call myself Sesame Street Generation 1.0, because I was not even yet 2, or I guess I'd barely turned 2 when Sesame Street debuted, and like we were 9 or 10 when the Muppet Show aired, and we were there when Fraggle Rock aired. So it was like we were the first generation that always had him. My mother had always told me when the Muppet Show came on, I remember I used to watch Rolf the Dog on the Jimmy Dean Show, and and 13-year-old me got so annoyed with my mother, like, that can't possibly be right, Mom. There were no Muppets back in the old days, and of course she was right. Rolf was on the Jimmy Dean Show in the 1960s. But it was one of those stories. I had been reading. I was on Jim Henson's Wikipedia page at some point in about 2008. I had just finished the Irving book, and I was reading something on that page, and I thought, gee, I wonder where they got that. And I went down to the bottom of the page to see the citations Because I always say, like anybody really cites anything on Wikipedia that well, but Muppet fans, I learned, are fantastic about citing their sources. And all the sources they cited were about the work. It was Jim Henson, Designs and Doodles, and Jim, it was just all these books about the work. There was no biography of him. And at that point, he'd been dead, almost 20 years. And I just thought, well, gee, that's really fascinating. I wonder why there's no biography of him. And I set out, first of all, to see if somebody was already doing it. And then when I found out there was nobody doing it, I set out to be the one who did it, which took about almost 3 years, because Jim has, he had a wife and 5 kids. And you have to meet with all 5 kids and with the widow and sort of make your case, because the thing about, it's not like Washington Irving's papers have all been collected and collated and notated. They continue to find letters all the time, but for the most part, they've all been collected by the University of Wisconsin, and they're all collected in these beautiful black hardcovers with gold lettering on the front. And I have all those in my house, and I can write about Irving using his letters and papers, which I can get in books. Jim Henson's letters and papers are privately held. They're not at the University of Maryland, where he went to college. They're not at the University of Connecticut, where the great puppetry program is. They're privately held in the Jim Henson Company archives in Long Island City, New York. So it was one of those things where, to do his biography the way I wanted to, which generally the way I like to do biography is try to let my subject talk to you as often as I can, was I really needed to have access to those letters and papers. And, that was one of the discussions I was having with Lisa Henson. At one point, she said something like, if we tell you no, are you going to go do this anyway? And I said, I don't think I can, because what's so important to this project is his voice, not mine. And the only way to get his voice into it was to have access to his papers, because as I found out, Jim saved a lot of stuff. He tended to save everything. And didn't talk all that much. That was the hardest part, is because he didn't sit for interviews that often. It's not like when I was writing about George Lucas, who's been interviewed constantly since he was like 26 years old. Jim didn't sit down all that often. There's not that much, not that many interviews to go to. But in the archives, just being able to find out what he wrote in internal memos to his staff, and drafts of Broadway shows that he wanted to put on in the early 1970s, and early drafts of the Muppet Show. I mean, that's where his voice really starts to come through, is even in something like that, in those business documents. So that was that was really the only way to do his story justice, was to have access to his voice more than anything else. So getting that access was all part of the journey as well.
Okay, is there some kind of commonality between Washington Irving, Jim Henson, George Lucas, and the Dr. Seuss biography? Is there something that there might be a little bit of fantasy worlds connecting all of them, but is there something that draws you to these certain topics?
Yeah, I mean, one of the common threads through all 4 of them is they were all sort of the founders of our, American imagination.
Okay.
At various points in our history and in our culture, they were our. That's the thing that's so cool and so much fun about Irving. Like, Irving was our pop culture at that time. Like, he's Stephen King. He's John Grisham. He was the guy that, like I was saying earlier, when he needed to renovate his house, he would write a book, because like Stephen King or like John Grisham or somebody like that, the book sold enough that he could renovate his house or put a new wing on his house or whatever he needed to do. He was our pop culture at the time. He was the pop culture of the era. He was probably more famous even than some of my other subjects. Actually, I was initially trying to pitch him as sort of like the Sinatra of the 18th century and the 19th century. But he's even sort of beyond that. There's not really a pop culture figure like him. I mean, he's almost the biggest one I've done, in a manner of speaking, because he was our American popular culture in that era. So famous that everybody, people they would come to his house and beg him to run for mayor of New York City, and everybody wanted him to plug their books. They wanted a kind word. They wanted an endorsement. They wanted to say they were friends with him. They wanted to be invited to Sunnyside. People would go out to his property and start breaking branches off of his trees so they could take them back home and say they had a piece of one of Washington Irving's trees. I mean, it was just crazy. So, he was our pop culture at the time. But also, like the other four, like really taps into the American imagination. Dr. Seuss, Jim Henson, George Lucas, Washington Irving. I mean, that's one of their big commonalities. They all define, American culture and the American imagination in their eras and in their chosen topic. Irving in the master of the short story, Seuss, the master of children's lit, Lucas, the master of, film. Creative film narrative, and Jim Henson, who's sort of the master creator of the Muppets, and really changed the way puppetry looked on television and was always pushing the envelope on filmmaking. So that's one of the big through lines all four of those guys have.
Well, okay, that makes sense. And, I'm sure Barbara is really going to enjoy.
Yeah, it does seem funny because, Irving, I did Irving and I did Jim Henson, and they're like, 170 years apart. But they really are the popular culture of their era.
Yeah, I see that. The American imagination developers, it's
even interesting from sort of a business perspective. I haven't thought a lot about this, but one of the things about Henson, Lucas, and Dr. Seuss is they were all, really adamant about controlling their product, controlling the marketing of their product. It's Henson and Lucas, they wanted to touch everything that was going to be marketed. Irving is kind of the same way. Irving's the one who, when his books are getting ready to be published in America, he tells his friends, write me a positive review. It's sort of a sock puppet review, but he's like, write me a review in the newspaper. So he's paving the way for his brand. For his marketing in that era, which is the book's going to come out to rave reviews. And he was the one who went through and made sure it did all the editing on it and made sure that, was complaining about it being over punctuated at one point. And, he's really controlling the marketing of his brand in the same way that Jim Henson, George Lucas, and Dr. Seuss all did.
Cool. Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about the development of Kermit the Frog and all the other Bert and Ernie working with Frank Oz. Hope we can get you back sometime soon for.
I would love to do that, and hopefully for that one, Barbara and I can talk for 4 hours.
It sounds like it. Okay, we have probably 3 minutes left. Is there anything else you like to say about Washington Irving? Promote a website. Do you have any? You had a dinner with Mark Olshaker. He's him. He's going to be returning in about a month. That's some pretty cool stuff. So we have mutual friends, Booger and Mark Olshaker now.
I guess what I'll leave everybody with is, so I was so glad to hear you, Mark, talk about enjoying my book on him, because one of the things I wanted to do with Irving is, I would say his bust sort of fell off the mantelpiece over maybe the last 100 years in American literature. I was an English major in college, and we sort of skipped him and went right to, the Mark Twain era. And it was sort of like, we were told that Washington Irving was here and he wrote Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Week, and then we moved on. So he's sort of the forgotten founding father, in a sense, of our literature. But one of the things I really wanted people to come to appreciate in his life is not just the work, which is important, but just what a fascinating guy he is, and how he's the only one, I think, who could have blazed the trail the way he did it. He had the right personality for it. He was brilliant when he needed to be. He was declared a dunce, but when it came time to inventing viral marketing, Irving invents viral marketing. When it comes time to figuring out how to crash a party at the White House, Irving can crash a party at the White House. So what I really hope is that readers will read the biography and fall in love with Irving, and then want to go read his books because of that. The books are important because of what they did for Americans and American literature, but I also hope you really come to appreciate just how interesting he is, and what a life that he led. And I think you'll have a lot of fun reading it because, again, as I said earlier, he really is kind of like Forrest Gump. You know, you get to see me interacting with Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens and Martin Van Buren and you know, Queen Victoria, who he writes in his journal. He sees her right at the beginning of her you know, long reign and talks about how her mouth hangs open all the time. So, you know, so all these famous characters that you know are moving in and out of Irving's story, and he's the main character in it. So I think he's really fun. I think he's really fascinating. And I hope you read the biography and just, you know, and take away a real sense of what a really fascinating guy he was. And I think you'll come to appreciate and understand why everybody wanted him as their dinner guest. And I think maybe you'll want him as your dinner guest as well.
Sounds great. Okay, we're almost out of time. So you can learn more about Brian by going to brianjjones.com. Thank you, Brian, for the wonderful evening, and you know, we look forward to having you return sometime soon.
You bet.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. See you next week.